Hey, y'all. On today's episode of Impacting Recovery Uncensored, we have our friend Harry Cunnane and owner of Ghost Pepper. He is a person in long-term recovery and shares his experience being in the industry. So tune in. Hey, guys. Welcome to Impacting Recovery Uncensored. I'm your host, Sarah Pritchard. And this is a podcast where we dive deep into real, uncensored, and truths about addiction, recovery, everything in between. No sugarcoating, no judgment, just honest conversations that can help make an impact and lift up the solution. So let's get started. Today, I'm very excited. We have our friend and owner of Ghost Pepper, Harry, with us today. Hey, how you doing?
Hey, grateful to be here. Love what you guys are doing with the podcast and at Impact. So excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thanks for jumping on. We kind of asked him last minute, and you're being a good sport and just popping in while you're in town visiting us. So
always game to talk recovery and lift up anybody that's doing good work in this space.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah. Sorry it's so cold. Normal. You're from up north, so I was hoping we'd have some warmer weather for you, but not today.
I was hoping for the same, but
yeah.
Birmingham's beautiful. Happy to be here.
Yeah. Well, I would love, because I don't know a ton about your story and how you got where you are and all of those things. So I would love to know more about, just how you got into this space and of course I know why you're here visiting us, but would love to just learn more.
Happy to. So I because I can go on and on, about recovery and my story, and but jump in at any time.
Yeah.
My story, I always say, kind of it's not unusual, right? Like all of us in recovery, we have, this common thread of, what we were afflicted by, what we were struggling with. But for me, like I start by saying, like, I grew up in an incredible home. I had two parents that did everything that they could to love and support me and set me up for a successful life. And what I experienced as a kid was that I always felt disconnected. Mm-hmm. In spite of all of the love around me, I felt like I was different. I felt like I was, I just kind of didn't have this playbook to life that everybody else around me had. And when I was an early teenager, I found drugs and alcohol, right? And for me, like immediately, I remember one of the first times that I, had a drink. I was about 13 years old, and I was drinking in the woods, and it was the first time that I got drunk. And I remember vividly in that moment, like my stomach was upset. I was probably throwing up all over the field. But I remember feeling a part of. I felt connected. I felt like all of the typical kind of fears and anxieties of being a teenager went away, right? Like I no longer had to try to be somebody else to fit in. I no longer had to do anything. We were just in it together with my friends. And I remember going to school on a bus the next Monday, and it was all I could think about, right? So like if I think about addiction or alcoholism, it was like none of those, none of the consequences had set in yet. I had only really, even been drunk one time, but like in my head, that was what I wanted to do because it worked. Like it solved those fears and anxieties that I felt.
Right. Regardless of you throwing up or your stomach hurting or, any of that, because normal drinkers are like, oh, that made me sick. So I'm going to maybe not do that again or maybe do something different.
Exactly. And it's funny because the first time I drank was before that, and I didn't get drunk. All I did was I got sick, but I still wanted to try it again. I was like, there's something here that like I got to see what this is all about. I come from a big Irish family, and drinking was around everything that we did. So I also felt like with alcohol that it wasn't really taboo, right? Like it's so socially acceptable. We do so much in our society around food and drinking.
Yeah.
Right. So it was like, my parents, who I looked up to and are incredible people, are not alcoholics, but would have a drink. Mm-hmm. Right. So it felt like something that I could do to feel more grown up, feel more, a part of. But what ended up happening was it progressed really quickly because at a point I got sick of my stomach getting upset and found other drugs where, I didn't have some of those side effects like I did. And other substances that allowed me to use more easily, like during the day in school. So I progressed really quickly. And from that first weekend, in the field to, within 2 years, I was doing cocaine every day in school. I was at a nice private school in Philadelphia. So it just wasn't, I knew something was off because at that
Right.
point it no longer kind of felt acceptable. I was hiding that even from my friends. And, my experience was I knew something was off. I did not want to identify myself as an alcoholic or an addict. I just couldn't see that
No,
for me.
never.
And definitely not, in my family, I felt like that was just not a path that I could take. I had gone through the DARE program and, had this idea, right, from my parents kind of, teaching me right and wrong. I had this belief that, like, drug addicts were bad. That was kind of ingrained in me. So then once I started to fall down that path, I refused to let myself identify with it.
Right.
Like I wouldn't let myself see it. And I would always look at it, it as kind of like a whack-a-mole problem of if I can just stop this one thing, then, then it's okay. Or I would always find somebody worse than me.
Oh, yeah.
It's like there's always somebody out there that was worse than me,
Yes.
even when I was a mess.
Yeah, and that's the thing that I didn't know is like you're talking about how you progress so quickly. It progresses at different rates in different people. And so you have somebody that's fully progressed at the, age of 18 or age 55 or 75. And so that can make it very confusing when we're trying to willpower our way into fixing the problem because we're constantly comparing ourselves to somebody else. Especially if we're lucky enough to find somebody worse than us. You know what
Absolutely.
I mean?
I always found a way to surround myself with at least one person who seemed worse.
Yeah.
So that way I could compare and I was always fine.
Right.
Because I wasn't that bad.
Yes.
But you're so right. I mean, for different people, it progresses at different rates, right? And at the time, for my family and myself and everybody, it was horrifying how quickly it progressed. But today, I'm grateful that it did because I was able to find, this life that I have at a younger age. But how we got there was I tried all the different things to stop on my own. I tried going to a college in a different town thinking it's my friends, it's my, my neighborhood, it's all of this. And that didn't work. I've learned in recovery there's great sayings that we use, but it's like wherever I go, I bring myself with me.
Yeah.
But really what happened at the end for me was at 20 years old, I found out that I was going to be a father, and I was completely caught up in opioids. I could not stop using. My life looked, just to kind of paint the picture a little bit of, where I was in life. I was in the process of dropping out of college. I was going to work in a warehouse. I was not eating. I was not doing anything that would take my money away from getting high. I lived around the next one. That was all that I could think about. And I knew at that point in time, because I had tried, other things in the past, I knew I had a problem and I had a really bleak outlook on my life. But I found out at 20 years old, I'm going to be a dad. And, I thought about my dad and the kind of dad that I wanted to be. And I knew that drugs weren't in that picture. And I believed that, having a daughter was going to save me. And I felt, in that moment, I felt so much hope. But what happened was, as soon as my daughter was born, I couldn't stop. I kept saying like, oh, when we get to it, I'll stop right before. And I was able to pull together a couple days before she was born. But when I was in the hospital, after my first daughter was born, I texted my best friends, who were also my dealers, and said, hey, man, you got to come see the baby. Let's celebrate. And I was using drugs again before I even left the hospital. Yeah. And for that next year, the desperation of just, feeling so broken that there's nothing I can do to fix this. I was not exposed to any solution. I wasn't exposed to anybody that was living a recovered life. I wasn't exposed to any of that. My peers were in the same spot I was. And I found out later that, there were people in recovery all around me.
Yeah.
I just was blind to it.
Right.
I couldn't see them. I
Oh, yeah.
legitimately had one living in my house. There was one of my uncles lived with us, and he had been to treatment in the 80s and, hadn't drank. And, I always just thought it was odd that he just drank straight tonic water all the time. But, he lived in my house. But, in my mind, I couldn't identify anybody out there that's in recovery. So I think, like a podcast like this, the more that we can amplify stories, but even more than that, amplify the solution that it's out there.
Right.
Is so important.
Yeah. And I mean, I love how you said, like, there's people all around you, but you couldn't see it. I mean, that was my experience. Not necessarily, like, I knew there were people that were getting better, but for me, I couldn't hear the message. Like, I couldn't hear, it just was not, it was bouncing off my shoulders, and then, because this amazing woman and friend now who helped me, she tried to help me over and over and over, and what she was telling me was not any different.
Yeah.
But by the time I was in that broken place, in that place of surrender, then I could actually hear it. Then I could actually, digest what she was saying. And so, I'm glad you pointed that out, because we're just in so much delusion and we don't even know it because it's delusion.
We have no idea. Well, when you were, when you had somebody trying to help you, what did that feel like? Before you were willing to hear it.
Yeah, I just remember her sitting down and being like, Sarah, there was a time when I was just super, like, all about me. I couldn't stop thinking about me. I couldn't help anybody else. I was full of fear. And I just remember thinking, this woman's a saint. She's talking about she couldn't help anybody else. Like, that didn't even come into my hemisphere,
Yep.
And not because I'm a bad person. I've just have been so self-consumed my whole life that, like, I never am like, oh, what could I do for you, Because I just, like you said, when you tried alcohol for the first time, like, you felt a part of, because for so long I felt very disconnected.
Yeah.
And I drank alcohol, and then I had connection with you, and I had connection with the mailman and the tree, like
everybody.
Just, right.
And I think, it's like when, for me at least, when I was there, in that spot, it's like we create so many problems that it becomes impossible. And how do I think about helping somebody else? Because my life is on fire all the time.
Yes.
And I can't seem to put the fire out. And that's what the last year for me looked like. It was me trying to be a 21-year-old dad addicted to drugs, trying to stop, but also like the deception coming in of, the thoughts in my head were telling me, even though I wanted to stop and I would promise myself every night that I would, in my mind I would say, if I just use one more time, right? If I'm not sick, if I'm not in withdrawal,
right,
I can take care of her.
Yes.
I can change her diaper. I, maybe can't be the best dad, but I can be present.
Yeah.
And, so that was just a devastating experience and led me to a place of real desperation where I just felt like, I felt like she would be better off without me. I felt like there was no solution. I felt like I was going to die this way. And, just after kind of in the lead up to her first birthday, my disease was continuing to progress. And, I started stealing from my family. And, it was the weekend of Hurricane Sandy, which kind of hit the Northeast in 2012. So it was like, all right, I got to hunker down and get enough drugs to get me through the weekend. I've got my daughter's birthday party. It was just a chaotic time. And I started stealing, and I knew I was going to get caught, right? I knew it. And, I started to think about like, all right, well, what am I going to say when I get caught? Because it was only a matter of time.
Right.
So like
I have a plan.
I needed a plan. And for days I thought about like, what's the plan? And I couldn't come up with anything. And then on Tuesday, October 30th, 2012, I remember it vividly. I go downstairs. I had moved back in with my parents. My life was a mess. I go downstairs, and in my parents' house on the dining room table, just like this, there's bank statements just all over the table with highlighter.
Yeah.
And, my mom just says, hey, we need to talk to you. My mom and my dad sit me down, and, they just said, like, we know it's drugs. Because I had lied to, they had tried and, over and over, and they were just like, we know it's drugs. Are you willing to get help?
Yeah, and that gives me chills because that's like the moment, like the gig is up.
It was up.
It's done.
It was up.
Which
go ahead.
Which I was gonna say is like the scariest moment, but it's also the best moment because it's like finally there is that special moment that is terrifying yet amazing to where you can actually get moved to change.
Yeah. And it's what's crazy about it to me in hindsight is it's not the first moment, right? Like there were so many other opportunities and there's so many times when I wanted help, right? But like the wanting help and the opportunity for help never seemed to align.
Yeah.
And this was one where, to your point, it was, when they said, do you want help? Again, I had been thinking about what's the story, what am I going to say? And, I had nothing. And for the first time, it felt like the truth, or just being honest was easier than the lie because the lie was always easier.
Right.
If it's got to be something else. And so I just said yes. I didn't have a story. I didn't have a explanation. I didn't try to say why or what was happening. I just said, yes, I'll get help. And I remember the relief that I felt. But I think what's interesting is like even then, I had this moment of relief and this hope and, what we call kind of a moment of clarity of like, all right, I'm standing at the edge of the cliff. I don't know what's on the other side, but like I will try something. But even in that feeling, I still used, right? So I had to go use the rest of my supply before I went to treatment. And I was incredibly fortunate to go to a great treatment center and then, go to a longer term place for about 90 days after that where, I was really exposed to the solution. And I'll back up to say when I signed up to say I'm going to go to treatment, in my mind, I'm thinking of rehab. And it's like, I think everybody has this really negative impression of rehab and what that looks like. And, I went with the, thinking of I don't want to die, and I know that I'm going to die if I keep doing this. I know that I'm going to die. And I don't want to, continue to feel this pain of like the lies and, what I was putting myself and everybody else around me through. But I had no hope for like a positive future. I just thought like maybe if I can stop, if I can get off of, these substances, then, my problems will go away and my life will be fine. And in my mind at the time, I thought it'll probably be miserable because the only thing that I knew how to cope with life was drugs. And I thought if I got rid of that, my life will be miserable, but I won't die.
Yeah.
And when I got around people in recovery, what I saw was it's like the little things of like just seeing people, one, like show up to work on time was wild. I didn't understand it. The smiles, the laughter, like that's what attracted me. And I think what, like the work that you guys are doing at Impact is remarkable because it has that feel, right? Like this is a really serious topic. And it's something that like I struggled with and my family struggled with immensely for years.
Yeah.
And it's also something that I think like we need to bring more levity to it because if we look at, treatment or rehab or, getting help, whatever that looks like, if we look at that as this like punitive thing or you just have to stop using, using drugs or drinking, it's not appealing, right? Like, I think about I couldn't identify people in recovery around me. Like if through this podcast or through storytelling, like if we're able to continue to get these stories out there of like, what do some of the gifts look like? Then for me, it's like, it's something that I want today. Yeah. And I never thought it would be that.
No, definitely
never. Not. So it's just, that's kind of where it all started.
Yeah.
And it started with just only the willingness, and the belief that like not confidence that it was going to work, but just the belief that like maybe, just maybe, it could get a little bit better.
Yes.
And like that's all it took to kind of open that door. And so that was in 2012. I've been in recovery since then, and like what has happened since then is truly like for me unbelievable, right? Because like my we hear these expressions, right? Like, but I remember hearing you could have a life beyond your wildest dreams. And like at the time, beyond my wildest dreams was just waking up and not wanting to get high.
Yeah.
Like if I can have that,
Right.
Like that is a life beyond my wildest dreams. But I had never been able to put thought into like what's after that.
Mm-hmm.
Or like if I get that, if the miracles start to happen, then what?
Yeah.
Right? Like if the obsession is lifted, then what?
Mm-hmm.
And what's amazing about recovery is the opportunity to continue to change, right? To continue to like go deeper and, look for, what is my purpose? How do I live my purpose? How do I help other people?
Right. And I mean, I cannot imagine being 21 years old in my peak of addiction, being a mother.
Yeah.
Like it's hard enough to be a parent, and then you throw in addiction, and it's just, that is just, I would be scared to death. And I mean, I say it all the time, like I would not be the mom that I am today without recovery in this way of life. Like there's no way.
Yeah.
Which is, I didn't even know like those two aligned.
No.
No. Like I just thought that you're going to take the alcohol away from me and I'm going to go sit in meetings and, have a boring life.
That's what's so much, bigger about this is it's not about the alcohol or the drugs.
Right.
Right. But like the process of change, the process of recovery, the work that we do impacts every area. So like if I think about the gifts today and, I could go on and on just with gratitude, but, and that's not to say everything has been easy since that day, right? Like it's still life.
Oh, yeah.
A lot happens. There's a lot of up and down and anxiety and fear and stress and struggle. But if I look back, on the life that I have, like I've heard an expression that I love, which is like, in recovery, we get to live 2 lifetimes in 1 lifetime, right? Like I love that because I look at, when I think back to that time, even telling this story, it is me. I know it's me. I know I did the things that I did. And today it doesn't even feel like me.
Right.
Like it's such a different person.
Yeah.
But like the gift of, my daughter was 1 when I went to treatment. She's 13 today. Like the relationship that we have today is incredible, right? Like she's been with me sort of through all of this and, like the ability to form a relationship that I couldn't even comprehend when I was using.
Yeah.
Right? Because we're so self-centered, at least I was.
Oh,
I couldn't comprehend it.
Well, and
unbelievable.
And I've been told before, like, Sarah, it's like a color you've never seen before.
Yeah.
It's like, how do you describe that? You got to experience it on your own.
I love that.
And so, I mean, it's just amazing, and that you went through all that. And, and now your daughter doesn't have any memory of a dad that was in active addiction. She has a present, sober, amazing dad.
Yeah. The dad, she's got, here's a lot about active recovery and, and I think it's important, right? Like, some of the things that excite me today are, through the work that I get to do, through, my life, how can we sort of like change the narrative? How do we shift the way that we're talking about this?
Right.
Right. Because like the way that I understood addiction as a kid was like, it's a bad thing.
Yes.
Right. I didn't see it as like something that I had no control over at the time. Like, so for my kids, like, and just the way that we talk about this as a culture, as a society, I think it's so important that we shift that. Mm-hmm. Right. And like, I think the way to do that is something like this, to lift up the solution.
Yeah.
And like lift up the stories of, how did you get it? What did it look like? What does it look like now? Because I think I needed that hope.
Yes.
And I couldn't find it.
Right.
I think families need that hope. I know my mom, talks about that, and the families that I've worked with since, it's so important, right? And we need to, there's a lot of talk about the stigma, but it's like we do need to be able to put some of this stuff out there.
Right.
And just talk about it in a transparent way.
Yeah. And the families especially don't want to be talking about this because they're like, my child or my husband or my wife is a terror, like, how could they be doing this? And this is so embarrassing. This is so humiliating. This is so just, inconsiderate, all these things. And what's crazy is it's bigger than the addict. The disease is bigger than us. We would never do the things that we've done if we had any sort of control over it. And for me, that was a long time misconception, because I'm like, I just am not strong enough.
Yeah.
I'm not strong enough to get through this, because that's what I was taught. If you want something in your life, you try harder.
Yeah.
And I was really trying, but I couldn't pull it off.
Yeah.
Couldn't pull it off on my own. And families, there's so much shame. And I mean, I get it, because we do some crazy stuff.
We do some shameful stuff.
Yeah. So for families to be able, and when we talk to families all the time, it's just like, they're like, wow, like this makes so much sense when we kind of explain to them like why their loved one might be in this just vicious cycle, where they thought it was more of like, well, he's choosing to get high in the, hospital, and his daughter's right there, and how could he do that? He must not love her as much. And I always say, like, if love were the answer, there would be so many more people sober.
Yeah.
But it's not big enough. It's not. It has nothing to do with one another, And I think that's important for people to know and understand, is like, if it's a disease, we can't be choosing or have control over this.
Yeah. And we shouldn't be shaming it.
Right.
I think what you said is so important, is what nobody could see, because one, I was trying to hide the fact that anything was even going on, but like nobody could see that I was trying, because my actions were the chaos, right? Like the situations that I was creating were, horrible to everybody around me, and myself included. Like everybody was a victim in the actions that I was taking. But like in my mind, I was trying so hard to stop, and it felt so defeating before I was exposed to this, to feel like no matter how hard I try, nothing is working.
Right.
Nothing is working. And I think families need to know that, right? Like it's, there are times when, I wanted nothing more than to stop. And I think like all of us have the stories of, I know for me, like I would, at night, we promised ourselves, like, when my daughter was really little, before I got into recovery, she was the only person that I kind of felt safe enough talking to, because she was too young to, repeat back what I was saying. But like I would talk to her and plead with her at night, and say like, I'm going to be better.
Yeah.
I'm going to be better. And I'd wake up the next day and I wasn't.
Yeah.
And it's like it crushes your spirit.
Yes. Yeah. And it's so amazing that you got the opportunity of that surrendered moment where your family's like, do you want help? You got help. And you got plugged up with people that are living this way of life and living a great life, because there's so much out there that does not work.
Yeah.
And it's hard to find it on your own, to like really find the true solution on your own. And, that's kind of like what we're trying to do at Impact, or not what we're trying to do. What we are doing is allow people to get exposed right when they walk in the door day one, and not have to figure it out when you leave, kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I know for me, the way that I was kind of exposed originally to like what some of this solution could look like, it wasn't made to really sound appealing. But like we can't do this alone.
Yeah.
I remember thinking about it like, oh, I've got to do these things. Hearing that in the beginning, it's like, I got to do this for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
And that's such a daunting thing for anyone, especially like a 21-year-old, 22-year-old at the time. But really quickly, like I shifted once I got surrounded by people who were living this way of life, to like, I wouldn't want to do this without the people.
Yeah.
Right? Like one, I can't, but like two, I couldn't imagine or want to, because like that was my path before I got exposed to this, was I'm going to try to do this on my own. And I think like what you guys are doing at Impact, of building that community and focusing, kind of like throwing people right in the middle. I think about like, in early recovery, it's a hard time. This is not an easy task for anyone.
Right.
But it's a doable thing. Like it's doable.
So doable.
It's so doable.
Yeah.
And it's simple.
It is
right?
very
Like we can complicate it. But but it's simple and it's doable, but it's like, it's so important to get thrown right in the middle, you know? So like, I think what you're doing at Impact of putting people at the center of that and, you know, creating opportunities to, it's like the system doesn't change, the solution doesn't change, but the way that you can deliver it does.
Yeah.
Right? Like the way that somebody's going to hear it,
Right.
I'm going to hear it differently maybe than you heard it. But at the end of the day, it's the same message.
Yeah. Yeah. And something I missed for so long, and something that we are just so passionate about at Impact, is getting these guys to go help other people, help the next person. And I'm sure you got exposed to that pretty early on too, which is, again, a daunting thing, like, because you're like, wait, help. I don't know how to help.
I'm trying to help myself.
Right. Yeah. And clearly that did not go well for
Yeah.
a long time for me. So it's like, maybe I'll just let other people help me,
Yeah.
and then they can tell me how to help somebody else,
Yeah.
you know?
And I love that with, you know, with Impact, where you're working to do that before somebody even leaves, right? Like teach them to teach it is something I've heard you guys say a lot is, you know, the goal isn't just to, you know, get the individual into recovery and into this way of life. It's like, teach them to teach it. Because I know for me, when I got into recovery early, you know, I was intimidated by the idea of helping people. But like the things that I knew that I needed were self-esteem, because I had none. I knew I needed purpose. And the opportunity to try to help somebody else gives you those things.
Yes.
Right? And then it like fuels it. It creates this fire that can grow. Because if not, it's like, well, why else? I've lost so many people that I love to this disease, you know, and for some reason I'm still here.
Right.
You know, so like for me to not try to help somebody else is like the most selfish. It's the most selfish thing I could do.
Right.
Because there are so many people that need it.
Yes.
Like there's so many people that need it and don't know about it. There's so many people that, you know, haven't been afforded an opportunity to change. You know, like, and my story is very privileged, right? Like I had all of the, you know, I often say like I was treated unfairly fair, right? Like I came into this without a criminal record, with the opportunity to go to, you know, get great care, long-term care, a family that was supporting me, siblings that were supporting me, parents, you know, all of the sort of advantages and opportunities, right? And I know there's so many that don't have that, but what is incredible about this process is it can work for anybody.
Yeah.
Right? Like it can, you know, there are real barriers, you know, that I think we need to like highlight and talk about for, you know, a lot of people out there, right, that don't have access or don't have resources or don't have, you know, just people in their corner kind of rooting for them and pushing for them. But what's amazing is like you can walk into some of these recovery circles and all of a sudden, like everything else, all the external like ego stuff that like I used to define who I am, like it goes away, and like we're there because we have a common, like we're afflicted by a common thing and we have a common purpose. Yeah. And it just levels the playing field.
Right.
Like completely.
Yeah. I know. I agree. That's been my experience too.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that was a thing.
I didn't know that was a thing. And I think, you know, it's like for anybody, it's such a cool thing because most people, if you're not in this, like you would never get to experience that in the same way. And I think it just creates a different type of like empathy, you know, that at least I have for whether it's somebody struggling with addiction or not. It's like, I just look at life as everybody's struggling with something. Yeah. Right? Like, you know, for me, the biggest thing was my addiction. You know, for a family member, it might be their loved one's addiction. For somebody else, it could be another illness, or it could be financial, or it could be so many different things. Everybody out here is struggling. Yeah. Like everybody's struggling, you know, but like what we have through this process is like an opportunity to heal that and have a community of other people that get it. Yeah. Right. Like if we can share our struggles, like we can grow together.
Right. And that's what I love what you're doing is you mentioned yesterday, really just like like lifting up and sharing, like, I don't even know how you put it, but just the positive aspect of all of this, and to really share that, because and we were talking about this earlier, but we've been in it for so long now, it's like my world, and I get it, but
Yeah.
I forget how much people don't know.
Yeah.
And not because it's bad, they just, whether they have never had a loved one in addiction until now, or, like, because I didn't know this world until I was in it.
Yeah.
And I was that person. I'm like, the alcoholic is the person under the bridge with the brown paper bag.
Yeah.
And they are, they're just a nobody going nowhere in life.
Yeah.
And then, fast forward a few years later, here I am about to die. But again, never got arrested. All these things that I thought would, check the boxes to make me an alcoholic. And I didn't check any of those boxes. So certainly I could not be.
Definitely not. Anything but that.
Right.
And that's what's cool. It's like whether it's, you or me or, because we often use like the brown paper bag under a bridge. It's like they can get it too. Anybody can get it. Like we see that, you and I see it every day, just in our circles of like people are getting better.
Yes.
But, for me in my process, right, like kind of how I got to the work that I do today and, was really kind of fueled by that. So my first 6 years in recovery, I didn't talk about it at all, right? I still had this shame of, I can't tell people that. And I kind of, I compartmentalized it. And for me, for a lot of people, I think that's important, right? To sort of like have the safety of not having to like put this out there because God forbid something goes wrong.
Right.
Right. God forbid things blow up again.
Yeah.
So not everybody has the ability to, talk about this openly right away. But I think it's important, for us or anybody that, is in a position to talk about it, right? So when I was about 6 years in recovery, my mom and I were presented with the opportunity to write a book. And, it was really to share our family's story of what we had been through, both from before, in the middle of it, and then a solution, and then like what it started to look like in the next 5 years, after I got into recovery. And through that process, I started to recognize that like, that's when I really pieced it together that when I was struggling, I couldn't identify anybody in recovery. And I think the value in sort of sharing those stories is important. So I started with that, and then I made a complete, 180 on my career to come work, in this field in behavioral health, and have since opened Ghost Pepper with, really the vision of how do we change the way we talk about addiction, right? Like, and by doing that, like, how do we lift up organizations like Impact that are doing incredible work and actually making an impact, and raise them up? Because usually it's like, what it comes down to is, impact it's small and intentionally so.
Yes.
Right? Like because you can actually give the guys that you're working with this incredible opportunity, this container where they can, find the solution and get well. And it's like, how do we lift up those stories?
Right.
Because I think whether it's families or, somebody like me when I was struggling, like, that's what I needed. I needed to know that, like, at least there's some hope out there.
Yeah.
Because I didn't feel any of it.
Right.
Like, I was completely hopeless. But, like, how do we get more of that going, right? So, like, what excites me today outside of, my family and my wife and my kids is the opportunity to try to change the way that we talk about this.
Yeah.
And I think it starts with lifting up people that are doing great work, lifting up the solution. Because, if you tune on the news, you'll hear about, but, we don't get enough about the solution. And I think the more that we can get stories out there and, talk about what it looked like in a realistic way, right? Like, don't overly paint the picture that it's, it's perfect. Like, my journey was really hard. I'm sure yours was.
Yeah.
Like, it's not easy. But what I can tell you more than, anything else is that it's worth it.
Yeah.
And despite me not believing it, it's possible.
Yeah. And it's incredible to be able to move through things that may be painful, may be scary, may be hard,
Yeah.
and not even think about drinking or using.
Yeah.
Like, that is a miracle for someone like me.
Yeah. And me.
Yeah.
Like that was the life beyond my wildest dreams.
Yeah.
To just not think about it.
Yeah.
Not wake up and not even think about it, but like not wake up having to do it. Like obsessing it more
Right.
than anything else.
Yeah.
Like that was, I couldn't fathom that. And then once we get that, it's like, you and Adams had the opportunity to create something like Impact Recovery Center, right? To go help, not just one or two, but a whole lot of people and help a whole lot of families. It's like that's the stuff that, when we're in that moment of, looking for help, or even if we're not looking, but like being a little bit willing or agreeable to go get help, we're not thinking that far out. Like, and that's where it's not us, it's not me doing it, right? Like, the path or plan for my life has not gone how I thought it would.
Yep.
Right. But like, I believe that it's going exactly how it's supposed to.
Yeah.
And I don't know what's next.
Yeah.
Right. But like, I'm excited for it because I think there's so much opportunity to try to help. And there's so much pain out there.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
And what can we do about it?
Hopefully a lot.
Hopefully a lot. I know we can do a lot.
I do too.
I know we can do a lot.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for
Thanks for
sitting
having me.
down. Anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
No, I'm grateful to be here. I'm grateful for what you're doing with the podcast, specifically to just talk about this in an uncensored way,
Yeah.
to be realistic about it, to be open about it, and to really try to change the narrative, to be more solution focused and more real.
Yeah.
Because I think we need that, and I think families need that, and I think the more that we can get this out there, the more people that we can help.
I think so too.
So thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you so much. All right, well, thank y'all for tuning in to this episode of Impacting Recovery Uncensored. I hope today's conversation has inspired you, opened your mind, maybe even your heart, given you a sense of hope. But remember, you're not alone. And if you found this episode helpful, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe and follow us on social. But until next time, keep healing, keep making an impact. Bye, y'all.
See ya.